Hello. School starts tomorrow in the year 2020, the infamous year 2020. And I don't have any jokes at the moment, so I'm just going to rip through this one pretty fast so I can get this done and maybe get some sleep sometime here soon. So here we go. We have talked about a lot of this so far. This is basically like population dynamics. Now, what that means in this case is population size, right? The number of individuals in that group that we call a population. That word population has two different meanings here. This is population size, right? So as time goes by, what can cause the population to increase or decrease? And at any one time, why is it where it is? Okay? And then what effects do things like have the density of population? And things like that. A lot of this stuff is, again, common sense. A lot of it related to back in evolution, where we saw this first, where we talked about unlimited reproductive potential. That obviously has to do with the size of a population and things that would limit that. And so that gets more into the realm of ecology. So here we go. One of the things, you might have some math, a little bit of math to do here, and just in a general logical kind of way, it's a little difficult to often tell how many individuals there are in this group that you're calling a population, however you want to define that, right? Like, how many great white sharks are there in the Atlantic Ocean? Well, how in the world do you count that? You can't go down and count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on your fingers, right? So there's a few mathematical models that allow us to have at least as good as we can a ballpark figure of that kind of thing. And one of these involves catching some creatures, tagging them, and then having another capture event and plugging all that into this equation. Now, this equation is not in your syllabus sheet, but it's a kind of equation they could give you and expect you to be able to do this simple, multiplication, division, math. So you go capture a bunch of organisms individually caught, you count how many of them there are, and then you mark them, and you let them go, release them, right? And then sometime later, right, no matter, whatever you decide, however long or later, after these marked ones have been running around, swimming around, whatever, you go capture another bunch. And that becomes a number. How many did you capture the second time? But in this second bunch you captured, there will likely, not necessarily always, but there will likely be some individuals that you caught the first time, and you'll know that, of course, because you marked them, right? So then that becomes this variable. How many in the second capture were ones that were marked because they were also captured in the first capture? And when you do this, you get some ballpark of how many of those great whites there are in the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a little bit in the syllabus, this aspect that's called an organism's life history. That's like a type of organism's life history. So using two examples from below, explain how reproduction, rearing, da 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 da, right? Various reproductive strategies that have evolved for your group, not an individual organism's reproductive strategy, right? But in your group, are you the kind of plant that only reproduces in the spring? Seasonal reproduction. Lots of animals do this too, but there's some animals like ourselves reproduce all year round. So that's one aspect of that thing that we call your species, your type's life history, right? So we have some famous examples of monarchs. They hatch out of their little cocoons, in the spring and the summer months, and they become reproductive really fast. But then if they emerge in the fall out of their cocoon, they diapause, the word got cut off, but they don't reproduce for a while. This is their life history, because if they reproduced in the fall, their little baby eggs and cocoons would be freezing in the winter, so they wait until the spring. Okay, so that's just one example. And so if you're told this story, this is the classic AP or IB thing, you're told a story about things like this. This is how they reproduce. If they, this is their life history. If they reproduce now, they reproduce right away. Or excuse me, if the little babies emerge now, they reproduce right away. But if they emerge in the fall, they wait for a while and then, give me a prediction about this or that and justify your prediction. Classic AP kind of question. Okay, so we have some ones that you can then again link to your environment and it becomes an ecological thing. So the kind where an organism reproduces large numbers of offspring every time they reproduce, and that might only be once in their life, right? After which the individual often dies. They're said to be R selected. I forget where the R comes from, to be quite honest. I used to know it, right? But what kind of organism would evolve to do it that way? Well, lots of those are in the desert, where a lot of the time the conditions for life, especially in terms of water, are not too great. So when do you want to maybe reproduce a bunch of babies? When it rains. And so you see these big bang reproduction things, and they're really neat pictures. And one happened like last year or the year before, where you had a lot of rain in the American Southwest desert, and all these plants started to flower, which is, reproduction stuff. That would be our selected big bang reproduction. So by contrast, some organisms only reproduce a few little babies at a time, and they do that repeatedly. And that means that there's lots of different times when it's likely that your babies will grow up to reproduce and pass on your genes, because remember, that's the bottom line evolutionarily in terms of a selection process that has resulted in this kind of reproductive strategy or that kind, this kind of life history or that kind, right? So if we now do this pretty simple math, right? What can cause your population size to change during some time interval, like from now to 5 years from now? Well, you add ones when things are born, and you subtract ones, subtract their minus sign when things die. But then also, things can move into or out of your population. So if you include all of those, then that's the simple math, and that would be simple to do. That's the simple math that would allow you to come up with that change in population size over change in time, and that would give you a rate, and they like rates. So, explain how the density of a population affects and is determined by resource availability. Well, if you have a whole lot of individuals in a small space, and space is a resource, right, as well as the food available in that space and all that, well, you might produce a density of individuals that causes your population size to crash because you've exceeded that ecosystem's ability to sustain you. So if that limits your population size growth, things that depend on density, like food availability and actual space and things like that, then you often get the very classic kind of population graph that looks like this. When there are few reproducing individuals, right, like there were here in 1940, all of these are actual studies of somewhere of this bird in this case, right, then you don't have the capacity, because you have few reproducing individuals, to make that many more babies, and so your population size grows, but not very quickly. That's called the lag phase, right? But then as you get more and more reproducers, that mathematical exponential kind of thing comes into play, and your group size can increase dramatically over much shorter periods of time, right? And that is some simple kind of math you might get with a graph like this. What was the rate of population change between 1970 and 1980? where you got to go, okay, 1970 we had, oh, I don't know, what's that, 50 individuals, and in 1980 we had, oh, like 75 or so, so 50 to 75, that's 25 in 10 years, 2.5 per year. There's your rate. Okay. So the kind of growth that's called K-selected, the kind of organism and the kind of life history that's called K-selective, has to do with the fact that the environment can only handle so many limited resources, a thing that we again talked about as a main component of the natural selection process, right? And so here you get these graphs that are on the same graph, these red and blue lines that represent what could be unlimited reproductive potential or great reproductive potential, and what actually is, that they're actually things that limit. So the blue one represents if a group of organisms had unlimited resources and space and things like that, if that was the description, what would you predict would happen to their population? And you would say it would skyrocket, and it wouldn't hurt to put the word exponentially in there, right? But describe then, explain what happens in that population represented by the red line. Well, somewhere along the way, and that would start right about here where the blue and the red line split, somewhere along the way, something was limiting that great reproductive potential, and therefore the number of their population, the population size, which is our y-axis here. Those things could be food availability, It could be a whole bunch of different things, but this is where that effect started to be seen. This is where a lot of natural selection's occurring, right? Where the organisms that get born with the traits that allow them to, live and reproduce better are going to be the ones that are still on this curve and survived, and the ones that didn't make it, that had the potential to make it but didn't have enough resources or availability or ability to make themselves available. That's the difference between these two lines. This is again called logistic growth, that log kind of thing. And so this is the more normal case for organisms that are again said to be K-selected. So here's this is a math thing that they used to ask you, this per capita, but that means per person, per head, right? Capita is head, per person. So they could ask you this kind of math. I'm just going to let you do it, right? I might turn this into a contest in class. But if you're given that kind of thing, they would expect you to be able to do this, even though they didn't say we might ask you per capita math. This is just simple logic and division, right? So that's the answer to that one.